Kate, thank you very much. That was both brilliant and brilliantly timed. An example to everyone who speaks next. And the next speaker, I'm delighted to say, is Rob Procter from Warwick University.
Well, good afternoon. So I'm talking today about a study of cyber hate on Twitter and looking a little bit at the implications of the study for social media governance strategies. This was a project funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council and involved a multidisciplinary team of researchers, apart from myself, computer scientists from Cardiff, Pete Burnap, and social researchers, Marina Drotka, Helena Webb, William Housley, Adam Edwards, and Matt Williams, the last three being from Cardiff University. So, I think we all realize now, you'll all be aware, I think, of examples of cyber hate and the damage they can cause to individuals or communities and indeed society at large. Politicians commonly are a target of cyber hate these days, as are various minorities and indeed women generally, it would seem. So, of course, given that this problem exists, we have to think about how we can attempt to manage and mitigate or moderate the conduct of social media users so that if we can't eliminate cyber hate, we can at least reduce its consequences. And this work was conducted as part of the Digital Wildfire Project funded by the ESRC, and it was a mixed methods, multidisciplinary project, including not only what I'm talking about mainly today, which is the use of machine learning and quantitative methods, but also qualitative methods. And one of our aims here is to try and see how qualitative methods of textual analysis could help to inform quantitative methods. For example, by identifying the ways in which one can encode certain kinds of features, which can then be used for machine classification purposes. So, first of all, there's a question about whether counter-speech is a viable response to cyber hate. Is there evidence that self-governance through counter-speech, and what I mean is somebody seeing a post which they identify as being hateful in some way, and they respond to it by pointing out that it's hateful and that this is therefore is conduct which is inappropriate. Does that kind of counter-speech amount to effective self-governance? The mobilizing the efforts of individuals to bring perpetrators to account. Does it actually have productive effects in terms of how it might help to close down instances of cyber hate in online communities? There is some evidence from studies, for example, by Jamie Bartlett and Alex Krasodomski-Jones at Demos, that counter-speech can have a beneficial effect, can help to mitigate hate speech. Also, Banesh et al. Have done a similar studies on Twitter. So we wanted to follow up on these studies and examine perhaps what kinds of counter-speech might be more effective. So there are two parts to this study. First of all, we wanted to train a classifier to distinguish between different types of responses to cyber hate. Apart from counter-speech, there's also, you will find people tweeting, for example, in support of what someone says that is arguably hateful. We wanted to examine the effect of counter-speech on thread length, using thread length as a proxy for harm. Now, that's a rather simple proxy, and I would admit that we need to think about more sophisticated ways of measuring harm. But we took thread length as an initial simple proxy for the potential harmful impact of cyber hate. So we collected a data set of Twitter threads, which are a series of posts linked together by the use of the reply function. So these, if you like, are sort of conversational interactions on Twitter. And each thread consists of a source post followed by replies, either to the source post or within that thread to other people that have posted in the thread. And as I said, we chose thread length as a proxy for potential harmful impact. And we wanted to investigate to what extent cyber hate posts attract support or disagreement from other people on Twitter, and whether this has an impact on the length of those interactions, and then arguably on the potential impact of the initial post. So here's an example of cyber hate. And like Kate, I'm not going to apologize for displaying the name of this particular person on Twitter, because she is a journalist and indeed makes, I think, a living by being controversial. Could say she's a troll, perhaps, I don't know. Definitions may vary. So this tweet says, as you can see, ginger babies, like a baby, just so much harder to love. So here we see a number of factors in play in order to construct what is arguably discriminatory, hateful about a particular category of individual. And indeed, there's what conversational analysis followers would call membership categorization going on with ginger babies. And then there's an othering statement here, the final sentence, just so much harder to love, which combined makes this a post that is being very negative about a particular group of individuals. So that's an example of hate speech. Here's an example response. I'm showing you these simply to suggest that if we're going to be able to develop ways of detecting and managing these kinds of behaviors, then we need to look at the raw data and try and understand how these different kinds of posts are constructed. So in this response, which we call counter speech, the person says, what gives you the right to judge people by their hair name or upbringing? Notice that sounds like a question, but ends with an exclamation mark. And this, from examining other examples of counter-speech, I think is a distinctive aspect of counter-speech, where questions are ended with exclamation marks, not question marks. It's a disgrace, and you're extremely offensive. And then there's a hashtag, which you might interpret as being an attempt to recruit other people to join in condemning the tweet by Katie Hopkins. And here you can see an example thread, again, from following that particular example of Katie Hopkins. You can see here how a number of people have responded. There are 10, another 9 tweets, some of which are supportive, some are not so. And this is what we were collecting for the subsequent analysis. So, what we can say is that cyber hate does not necessarily contain individual words that are offensive, but it's the way in which they are used in combination and certain kinds of linguistic features that create the overall impression of being discriminatory, negative references, drawing on a motive, and or divisive categorizations. So what this points to is we need a more nuanced understanding of cyber hate than simply looking for examples of words that we might clearly recognize as being hateful. The way in which cyber hate is conducted, is performed, is much more subtle than that. And similarly, the ways in which people perform counter-speech must be understood to require a more subtle interpretation. So, we collected tweets from what we call sentinel accounts that you can find on Twitter. These are homophobes, yes, you're racist, and yes, you're sexist. And these accounts seemingly seek out to find examples of hate speech under these different categories and retweet them in order to highlight to their followers and try and provoke a counter-speech response. So here we see self-governance in action or attempt to do self-governance on Twitter. And we collected overall 300 threads, 100 homophobic, 100 racist, and 100 sexist. And here's what we constructed as being the annotation scheme for this data. So we could have a ground truth data set which we would then train a classifier on. So you can see we have 7 different categories ranging from being cyber hate, support for disagreement or counter speech, and then we had presenting evidence in support of that post, cyber hate, or evidence in support of disagreement or counter speech, general insults, and general response, which does not fit any of those particular categories. That turned out to be quite a difficult annotation scheme to apply, and I think we need to assess again if we can come up with a better, perhaps sometimes more easily interpretable annotation scheme. So let me deal first with the cyber hate response classifier. So we tried a number of different types of classifier. We tried a baseline bag of words, and then known hateful terms and phrases based on race, gender, and sexual orientation. And then we tried also type dependencies, which are syntactic grammatical relationships that have potential to capture othering language. Othering language here being an attempt to mark somebody or some group out as being different from the rest of society. And here you can see, using the Stanford parser, the type dependencies that can be extracted from that particular tweet. The tweet, totally fed up with the way this country has turned into a haven for terrorists, send them all back home. And the interesting type dependency here would be, for example, the one beginning with noun subject, home, and them. This is an othering phrase, in other words. They are different, send them home. Home is not where you live. They live, they're from somewhere else. And this is work that Pete Burnap and Matt Williams did, which we then looked to apply for building the classifier with this additional feature of type dependencies. So we tried a support vector machine with linear kernel and a random forest decision tree with 100 trees, and in the end, we then tried to model 4 different classes, labels: cyber hate, support for cyber hate, counter speech, and general, and we then evaluated the classifiers based on tenfold cross-validation. It turned out that the support vector machine was far superior, so I'm only going to report those results here today. Here we have, at the top, we have the actual summary of the different labels as ground truth for the 3 different types of hate speech. And then below that, we have the performance of the classifiers, a simple bag of words, then type dependencies, and then a combination of the above. And you can see that in some cases, combining type dependencies with bag of words produces a small improvement in the overall performance. Not a major improvement, and indeed, in the sexist case, it doesn't result in improvement at all. It's slightly worse. So it seems that type dependencies here were not that particularly helpful in improving classifier performance. Let me turn now to thread length modeling. And we looked at, or tried, linear regression, where the dependent variable is thread length, our proxy for impact. And we looked at independent variables: cyber hate, supporting posts, disagreeing posts, or counter speech, insults, unique contributors of original poster, original poster contributions, unique contributors of cyber hate, and unique contributors of counter speech. So a number of different independent variables we used to see which of these had some kind of impact on thread length. Was there some correlation between these features or independent variables and a dependent variable of thread length? And here's a summary over the 3 different types of cyber hate. And what's interesting here is that counter speech, which is the top row marked in yellow, doesn't have a beneficial effect on thread length. In other words, it actually increases it. It's significant. It's a significant variable for increasing thread length. So that seems to say, well, counter-speech isn't much use if we just count the number of counter-speech contributions. What, however, we also find, looking more closely, if you see the second row marked in yellow, is that the number of unique counter-speech contributors is negatively correlated with thread length, and therefore, and that's statistically significant. And it seems that whilst counter-speech leads to longer threads, if that counter-speech is conducted by a large number of unique posters, then that has an effect of reducing thread length. So what this means is that the effectiveness of counter-speech is sensitive to how it is organized. If you have one person doing a lot of counter-speech or a few people doing a lot of counter-speech, the impact will not be very effective. If you have a large number of people doing just one or two posts, in other words, a kind of crowd effect, that's more likely to have a beneficial impact in reducing thread length. So larger numbers doing less is better than small numbers doing more, you could conclude. So, okay, so to conclude, we've been looking at is how analysis of interactional and linguistic features of threads can better inform feature selection for cyber hate and counter-speech. And here I come back to the fact that we're doing a multidisciplinary study. We're trying to learn from qualitative analysis of text, in particular conversation analysis, and the way that that informs the sequential organization of talk on Twitter, and also the way in which that can reveal features like membership categorization devices and the way that they are deployed, for example, in doing othering. But we need, I think, from our results to do a lot more in order to tease out how we can use these insights in order to do better feature selection and annotation. So that is work that we would like to take forward from this study. Let me just conclude by, I think, echoing what Kate was saying. She said it's a very complicated phenomenon, behavior on Twitter, whether it's disinformation or indeed whether it is hate speech. And we need a variety of different mechanisms in concert in order to bring about more orderly conduct on social media. If you look at this figure here, what we've got on the y-axis is responses that are centralized or decentralized, and counter-speech is a decentralized and social response because it depends upon individual actions. Blocking users is, however, is a centralized and technological response. Then we've got, is a decentralized but technological response. Algorithmic moderation is centralized and technological. And then you've got legal regulation of platform policies, which is a social but centralized mechanism. What we'd argue, again, echoing what Kate was saying, we need to bring these different approaches into alignment and understand the ways in which they can be used together in order to improve the conduct of people on social media platforms. Social media governance is a socio-technical problem, and we need to understand what combinations of centralized and decentralized social and technical responses will be effective. It's likely, of course, that the combinations and the way they're used will have to change over time because people's behavior will change in response to the kinds of governance mechanisms they encounter. What we do, I think, witness is that social media platforms are now proactive in taking down hate speech as the new media landscape is becoming re-intermediated. That's as to say, social media platforms are acknowledging that they are not just infrastructure that allows people to post their thoughts out into the public domain, but they're actually publishers and have some responsibility for what appears. And that is a quite an important step forward, I think. This is re-intermediation of social media, and I think this is going to be very important. And we need to continue the dialogue between researchers authorities, social media platforms, and civil society organisations who represent some of the minorities that are targeted in hate speech to understand how to evolve a coordinated response to this behaviour. Thank you.